Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Glad to have you here. So for this week's video, I am starting a new series called A Few Pages, in which I'll be narrating some of my favorite passages from some of my favorite novels. And like I mentioned in my first Tim Recommends video, I just recently finished reading The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I originally read this book in high school, and I found that over 10 years later, my perspective on life and literature and writing in general has changed dramatically. And the perspectives and insights I've gained from this book are completely different than when I was just a teenager. And I feel that Fitzgerald just has such an incredible mastery of the English language. He has this lyricism that makes the words come alive, and it feels almost like an extended poem more than just a book. He has this incredible style and way with words that just makes you feel like you're living the experience and you really can understand what he's saying through the words and feelings of his characters and settings. And so to set up this clip, I just wanted to give a brief overview of the book and setting in case you've never read it or maybe read it a long time ago and could use a refresher. Mild spoiler warning, this excerpt takes place at the end of chapter 6, which is about halfway through the book. So, to start things off, the book is narrated by one Nick Carraway, a 30-year-old professional who has recently moved to New York in order to start a new life and learn about stocks and bonds and the whole business world. Upon moving there, he finds that his next-door neighbor is an extravagantly wealthy man named J. Gatsby, who lives in an opulent mansion and throws these over-the-top insane parties for all the wealthy inhabitants of East and West Egg. Through the course of the book, we find that Gatsby's wealth may have been obtained through illicit means and has this general mysterious aura about him where people don't really know where he's from, where his money's from, or who he even really is. But what we do know is that Gatsby was romantically involved with Nick's cousin, Daisy, 5 years prior. Daisy comes from a very wealthy family, and Gatsby does not. They met and fell in love in Daisy's hometown, but their romance was short-lived, as Gatsby had to leave to Europe due to his enlistment in the army for World War I. In that time span, Daisy met and married one Tom Buchanan, a muscular, wealthy, racist womanizer who has entertained many affairs during the course of their marriage, including one right now. Leading up to this scene, Daisy and Gatsby have just very recently met and are in the midst of rekindling their lost romance. In this excerpt, we see the end of one of Gatsby's opulent parties that Daisy and Tom had attended for the very first time with Nick in tow. Tom is suspicious but doesn't know the whole story yet, and so we arrive in the wee hours of the morning, the end of one of Gatsby's famous parties. So with that being said, let's read A Few Pages with The Great Gatsby. Almost the last thing I remember was standing with Daisy and watching the moving picture director and his star. They were still under the white plum tree, and their faces were touching, except for a pale, thin ray of moonlight between. It occurred to me that he had been very slowly bending toward her all evening to attain this proximity. And even while I watched, I saw him stoop one ultimate degree and kiss at her cheek. "I like her," said Daisy. "I think she's lovely." But the rest offended her. And inarguably, because it wasn't a gesture, but an emotion, she was appalled by West Egg, this unprecedented place that Broadway had begotten upon a Long Island fishing village. Appalled by its raw vigor that chafed under the old euphemisms, and by the too obtrusive fate that herded its inhabitants along a shortcut from nothing to nothing. She saw something awful in the very simplicity she failed to understand. I sat on the front steps with them while they waited for their car. It was dark here in front. Only the bright door sent 10 square feet of light volleying out into the soft, black morning. Sometimes a shadow moved against the dressing room blind above, gave way to another shadow, an indefinite procession of shadows, who rouged and powdered in an invisible glass. "Who is this Gatsby anyhow?" demanded Tom suddenly. "Some big bootlegger?" "Where'd you hear that?" I inquired. "I didn't hear it. I imagined it. A lot of these newly rich people are just big bootleggers, you know." "Not Gatsby," I said shortly. He was silent for a moment. The pebbles of the drive crunched under his feet. "Well, he certainly must have strained himself to get this menagerie together." A breeze stirred the gray haze of Daisy's fur collar. At least they're more interesting than the people we know, she said with an effort. You didn't look so interested. Well, I was. Tom laughed and turned to me. Did you notice Daisy's face when that girl asked her to put her under a cold shower? Daisy began to sing with the music in a husky, rhythmic whisper, bringing out a meaning in each word that it had never had before and would never have again. When the melody rose, her voice broke up sweetly, following it, in a way contralto voices have, and each change tipped out a little of her warm human magic upon the air. Lots of people who come haven't been invited, she said suddenly. That girl hadn't been invited. They simply forced their way in, and he's too polite to object. I'd like to know who he is and what he does, insisted Tom. And I think I'll make a point of finding out. I can tell you right now, she answered. He owned some drugstores, a lot of drugstores. He built them up himself. The dilatory limousine came rolling up the drive. Good night, Nick, said Daisy. Her glance left me and sought the lighted top of the steps, where 3 o'clock in the morning, a neat, sad little waltz of that year, was drifting out the open door. After all, in the very casualness of Gatsby's party, there were romantic possibilities totally absent from her world. What was it up there in the song that seemed to be calling her back inside? What would happen now in the dim, incalculable hours? Perhaps some unbelievable guest would arrive, a person infinitely rare and to be marveled at. Some authentically radiant young girl who, with one fresh glance at Gatsby, one moment of magical encounter, would blot out those 5 years of unwavering devotion. I stayed late that night. Gatsby asked me to wait until he was free, and I lingered in the garden until the inevitable swimming party had run up, chilled and exalted, from the black beach, until the lights were extinguished in the guest rooms overhead. When he came down the steps at last, the tanned skin was drawn unusually tight on his face, and his eyes were bright and tired. She didn't like it, he said immediately. Of course she did. She didn't like it, he insisted. She didn't have a good time. He was silent, and I guessed at his unutterable depression. I feel far away from her, he said. It's hard to make her understand. You mean about the dance? The dance? He dismissed all dances he had given with a snap of his fingers. Old sport. The dance is unimportant. He wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she should go to Tom and say, I never loved you. After she had obliterated 3 years with that sentence, they could decide upon the more practical measures to be taken. One of them was that, after she was free, they were to go back to Louisville and be married from her house, just as if it were 5 years ago. And she doesn't understand, he said. She used to be able to understand. We'd sit for hours. He broke off and began to walk up and down a desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past? He cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking here in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand. I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before, he said, nodding determinedly. She'll see. He talked a lot about the past, and I gathered that he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. One autumn night, 5 years before, they had been walking down the street when the leaves were falling, and they came to a place where there were no trees and the sidewalk was white with moonlight. They stopped here and turned toward each other. Now it was a cool night with that mysterious excitement in it which comes at the 2 changes of the year. The quiet lights in the houses were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and bustle among the stars. Out of the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalks really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb to it if he climbed alone. And once there, he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. His heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl, and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Through all, he said, even through his appalling sentimentality, I was reminded of something, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I had heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment, a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth, and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. But they made no sound, and what I had almost remembered was uncommunicable forever. So, what do you guys think? My intention was to really bring this text to life, in the same way that it's alive to me. Reading through this book again, I really can understand now why it's an American classic. And there are so many themes, motifs, archetypes, interesting philosophies, interesting arguments. The entire book is really just this incredible journey through 1920s America, and Fitzgerald is the king of the era and truly understands the representation of what it is he's writing about and the characters involved. I think that this passage in particular really exemplifies the totality of the book, differing feelings that each character has, the longing that Gatsby has for an unobtainable past. He's always reaching for this moment in time that has passed, and just as Nick says, you can't repeat the past, but Gatsby is intent on doing so, just like so many of us. And I think that really speaks to the key of what this book means, or at least what it means to me. I feel like this passage just really explores the depth of Fitzgerald's mastery of the language and his real lyricism. It's amazing how much he is able to convey in feelings, emotions, and philosophy in such a short novel. But in other ways, it's almost like an extended poem, a very long poem. It's just two different ways of looking at the same text, and I think that really speaks to the level of mastery that Fitzgerald had on the English language and literature in general, really. If you really enjoyed this and wanted to hear a full analysis of the book, let me know in the comments. Maybe that's something I'll explore in the future. So I hope that this was interesting, entertaining, and maybe gave a glimpse into why I felt that The Great Gatsby truly is one of the great classics of a generation and is totally worth your time to read, even if you've already read it before. And so what did you guys think of A Few Pages? Like I said, this is the first video in the series, and I hope to do many more of these. So go ahead and let me know what some of your favorite books are, some things you would like me to narrate in the future. I'm always open, always looking for new things to explore, new books to read, new ways to expand my mind. I really enjoyed making this, and I hope that you enjoyed watching and listening. But I think that's pretty much all I have, so as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.